Let's turn to our last presentation this morning with Dr. Theodore Levterov. He comes originally from Bulgaria, and he's an associate director of the Ellen G. White Estate back then in Maryland. Dr. Levterov holds a PhD in Adventist Studies from Andrews University, and has previously worked as a pastor in his native country of Bulgaria and for the Texas Conference here in the US, as well as professor of religion at Loma Linda University. Recently, he authored the book Accepting Ellen White, Early Seventh-day Adventists and the Gift of Prophecy Dilemma. His topic for today is the Messenger of Truth, the first anti-Ellen White periodical and its aftermath. Just remember, our attendees, to submit your questions on the Q&A place in the Zoom app, just in the bottom of the app, and all that will be collected for the panel discussion at 4 p.m. Dr. Levterov, the time is yours. You also have 40 minutes for your presentation until 11:55. Thank you very much for being here with us.
Thank you, Alberto. It is wonderful to be with all of you, even virtually. Technology, it's amazing because it connects us. So we don't have to be in Michigan if there is snow even. I've been blessed by the presentations from Ben and Ashley, and I learned a lot of new things. What I'm going to present, it's my little contribution to Seventh-day Adventism, to the history of our church, because when I was writing my dissertation, and I'll just summarize my introduction, and then go into the paper and read part of it. But when I was writing my dissertation, I kept on noticing that early Sabbath-keeping Adventists were responding to this paper called The Messenger of Truth. So I went to my professors and I asked about it, and they told me that there were no existing copies of it. So being a Bulgarian, I didn't believe them. So I went back to the library and I started searching for it. And indeed, I couldn't find anything. Until one day, I was looking for some books for a class on Adventism and religious liberty, and I decided again to Google Messenger of Truth, and here it came. I found that there were 3 existing copies in the State Library of Pennsylvania, original copies, but they didn't want to even show them to me. And so I worked with Dr. Burt, who was the director of the Center for Adventist Research at that time. And it's a long story, but after several months, we got photographic copies of the 3 existing issues of the Messenger of Truth. So anyway, that's my little contribution to Adventism. So in the following paper, I want to give you a little concise history and context of how the paper came about, how it appeared. Then in the second part, I will examine what were some of the main objections, because that was the first periodical aimed specifically against the Sabbath-keeping Adventists in the 1850s and Ellen White specifically. So I will look at some of the major objections. We cannot cover everything, of course. And the questions that they raised, and you will see that really time has not changed much. And in the third part, I will examine what were the effects, how early Sabbath-keeping Adventists responded to these objections. And I will try to show you that, in fact, it was critical in its nature. The Messenger of Truth really helped the Adventists to re-examine their belief, to develop a stronger belief in the biblical foundation of the gift of prophecy and Ellen White, and then I'll finish with some recommendations. So let's see if I can do this in 40 minutes. Let's begin with a little history of the Messenger of Truth periodical, and I will read, as I said, part of my paper, and then probably skip some parts. As I said, the first non-organized opposition to Ellen White's prophetic claims from dissident Sabbatarian Adventists. And by the way, notice this is not, I mean, we don't have a church at that time. There's no Seventh-day Adventists, so I'll call them Sabbatarians or Sabbath-keeping Adventists. But this paper appeared in the early 1850s. The group, the opposition group, became known as the Messenger Party, primarily because of a periodical they started to publish called the Messenger of Truth. The messengers, as they began to be called, originated in Jackson, Michigan, and were led by two former Sabbath-keeping Adventist ministers, H.S. Case and C.P. Russell. The rebellion came as a result of a controversy over the validity of the prophetic gift of Ellen White. In fact, so the first kind of a crisis that we have in this Sabbath-keeping group is because of the gift of prophecy. In 1853, Case and Russell, who led the Sabbath-keeping Adventists in Jackson, Michigan, accused Mrs. Dawn Palmer, a member of the Jackson Sabbatarian group, of losing her temper and using a vile name against a hostile neighbor. The accused lady admitted that she was upset with her neighbor, but denied using the specified word. The arguments were going back and forth. Meanwhile, the White's family came to visit the group in Jackson, and while there, Ellen White had a vision concerning the disputed situation. It was revealed to her that Mrs. Palmer had indeed lost her temper and had not acted as a genuine Christian. At this point, Case and Russell, the two ministers, seemed to be exuberant over Ellen White's revelations and expressed full confidence in her vision. On the following day, Ellen White had a second vision in which she was shown that Mrs. Palmer did not use the particular word she was accused of using. In addition, she was revealed that God was displeased with the unkind and uncompassionate spirit that the two ministers had shown towards her. While Mrs. Palmer confessed her wrongdoing and asked for forgiveness for losing her temper and calling her neighbor a witch, Case and Russell got upset with Ellen White and rejected her second vision as false and unreliable. This eventually led to their full rejection of Ellen White's prophetic gift and the formation of the first offshoot from the Sabbath-keeping Adventist group in June of 1853. Case and Russell started to publicize their critical ideas in a paper called The Messenger of Truth, and their supporters became gradually known, as I said, the Messenger Party. The paper seemed to have existed until 1853, when it discontinued because of lack of financial support. The Messenger Party was soon joined by the Age to Come group, another opposition faction to Ellen White during the early 1850s. Now, I will read this paragraph, but what I show in the paper is the Age to Come group basically became part of this, the Messenger Party group. So they united their efforts to criticize Ellen White. The three surviving issues of the Messenger of Truth revealed that the main purpose of the paper, at least initially, was to speak against Ellen White's prophetic claims, to oppose the work of leadership of James White, and to criticize the Sabbath-keeping Adventists and the unchristian attitudes towards those who did not agree with them theologically. In this section, I will center mainly on the main objections against Ellen White's prophetic gift because of the primary purpose of this paper. You find some other critics against James White and his leadership and so forth, but I'll concentrate on the arguments they basically wrote, they posted against Ellen White. The Messenger of Truth and major objections. The three extant issues of Messenger of Truth revealed several specific charges that the so-called messengers brought against Ellen White. First, they claimed that the Sabbath-keeping believers had another rule of faith and practice in addition to the Bible, and they said, you have the Bible and also the visions of Ellen White. I mean, that's how you base your beliefs on. C.P. Russell, for example, wrote that the Sabbatarians were under the influence of this Ellen White's vain visions. he summarized the attitude of the messengers towards Ellen White's prophetic gift in writing that we have no human creed, no ground stakes out by modern visions, and he capitalized modern visions. We believe that God's truth is progressive and self-evident and will be a scrutiny by itself. Similarly, another messenger argued that since all scripture was given by inspiration of God, 2 Timothy 3, the Bible contained all that one needed to comprehend God and his will. And then he quoted Revelation 22, Proverbs 30, chapter 30, verse 5, Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 2. And he concluded that the only rule of faith for the believers is the Bible. So the applications of the messengers were clear. There was no need for new visions and revelations because they had the Bible. In a similar line of thought, R.R. Chaplin, another messenger, believed that if the revelations of Sister White were to judge the remnant, this was adding to the revelations of Jesus Christ, the Bible. Thus, he alleged that it was the messenger mission to help Sabbath-keeping believers to realize Ellen White's false prophetic claims and to have this yoke of bondage, this is a quote, removed from them as soon as possible. In addition, the messengers' followers also claimed that Ellen White's revelations contradicted the Bible. And I give few examples here that I will skip, but basically they said, well, what she reveals contradicts the Bible. There's one writer who writes, some things have been presented to us by Brother Bates and others, this author wrote, which I could not reconcile with the Bible. And when I insisted on their giving scriptural evidence, which they could not do, they would say, Ellen saw it was so, and they believed it. I was told them that they thought more of the visions that they did of the word of God. So you see this type of arguments. I mean, you have Ellen White and she's, for you, it's like the Bible. She's, so you have two books that you base your beliefs on, and this goes on and on. I'll skip that, but there's one letter in the messenger that even calls Ellen White, I mean, the Jezebel of the Sabbatarian group and so forth. So that's the first charge. The second charge was related to the manifestation of the prophetic gift in the last days. Based on the prophecies of Joel 2 and Acts 2, the Sabbatarians argued for the modern manifestation of the gift of prophecy just before the second coming of Christ. Ellen White's gift was a proof for them that they were living in the last days. While the messenger party agreed with the Sabbath-keeping believers that they were living in the last days, they disagreed with them on the interpretation of Joel 2 and Acts 2 and their connection to the last days. The messengers argued that the fulfillment of these biblical prophecies happened during the apostolic time because there was an obvious need for it. And I quote here from the messenger, God had not worked by the gifts of prophecy and visions to establish the gospel. God saw that it was necessary to give prophets and apostles at that time and did so. However, after they fulfilled their mission, the apostolic and prophetic gift ended with John in AD 96, they argued. So the argument was there were no prophets after the apostolic age. And there are a few more examples that I give, but you get the type of arguments that they established. A third type of objections was related to the remnant question. Based on Revelation 12:17, the Sabbath-keeping believers claim to be the true remnant people of God because they kept the commandments of God and had the testimony of Jesus. Revelation 12:17. Contrary to the Sabbatarians, the messengers argued that the testimony of Jesus in Revelation 12 was not necessarily a reference to the prophetic gift, in this case, a reference to the prophetic gift of Ellen White. For them, the spirit of prophecy was the spirit of Christ, that the true remnant had to represent and had nothing to do with the gift of prophecy. To make their point even stronger, the messenger of truth published numerous accusations against the Sabbath-keeping believers and their leaders for their harsh and unforgiving spirit towards those who had joined the messenger party. For example, C.P. Russell noted that the Sabbath-keeping believers could not be the true remnant to proclaim the third angel's message because they hated their brethren and cast them out of their group. Such people, he wrote, could not be keeping the commandments of God. Instead, the proclamation of the third angel's message was reserved for the true remnant, those that preach it and live it out. In other words, they said, we the messengers of the remnant. The messengers therefore contended that they were the true remnant people of God at the end of time. The Sabbath-keeping believers, they said, lacked the true spirit of Jesus. Therefore, the argument to be the remnant because of Ellen White's prophetic gift was irrelevant and untrue. And the fourth objection that you find in the paper against Ellen White visions was the claim by the messengers that the Sabbatarians had made Ellen White's prophetic gift a test of fellowship and a rule of action. The messenger of truth published several stories to prove their point. A certain J.B. Bezos, for instance, gave a lengthy description of H.S.K's trial, one of those Sabbatarian preachers, and his disfellowship from the Sabbatarian group because of doubts towards Ellen White and her prophetic gift. The same fate awaited a certain brother Drew, who did not believe that the visions were equally inspired with the visions of Daniel and John. R.R. Chapin also wrote a letter in 1854 to the messengers, noting that despite the Sabbatarian denial of making the visions a test of Christian fellowship, he knew of many who were cut off for this fellowship because they did not believe the visions. Some other objections that are found in the paper included the visions contradicted biblical facts, they brought disunity, caused confusion, and so forth. But those are the main objections. The Sabbatarians, of course, disagreed with the messenger's objections. And in fact, the messenger crisis and the publication of the messenger of truth prompted the Sabbath-keeping believers in 1850s to begin and develop a more systematic and methodological defense of their belief in the prophetic gift. And so in the next part 3, I will examine some of the outcomes, what came out, how they responded. And usually the responded were published in what I call the Adventist Facebook, Review and Herald, right? So how they responded. There were several outcomes from this crisis. First, the Sabbath-keeping Adventists became much more intentional in their explanation regarding the relationship between the Bible and Ellen White's prophetic gift. Even before the messenger's accusations that they had another rule of faith in addition to the Bible, the Sabbath-keeping Adventists had expressed very plainly their stand on the issue. In one of the most, I think, critical articles published in 1851, James White writes the following, and I quote here. It's quite a lengthy quote, but I will read it because it's important. He noted, the gifts of the Spirit should all have their proper place. The Bible is an everlasting rock. It is our rule of faith and practice. Every Christian is therefore in duty bound to take the Bible as a perfect rule of faith and duty. He should pray fervently to be aided by the Holy Spirit in searching the scriptures for the whole truth and for his whole duty. He is not at liberty to turn from them to learn his duty through any of the gifts. We say that the very moment he does that, he places the gifts in the wrong place and takes an extremely dangerous position. The word should be in front, and the eye of the church should be placed upon it. And the quote continues. But you see the point that James White is making. He's saying, no, we never believe that. We believe that the Bible is leading and the gifts are to support that. Evidently, for the Sabbath-keeping believers, the Bible had a primary leading role for the formation of their beliefs, while the gifts had an aiding or corrective function. The Sabbath keepers had never claimed equality between the Bible and the gifts of the Spirit, as James White wrote. In 1854 now, because of the controversy, James White republished his 1851 article, but he made a note that accompanied the republication, in which he stated the reasons for the reprint. And I quote here, that our readers may see for themselves what our position has ever been on this subject, and that they may be better prepared to dispose of the statements of those who seek to injure us. The position that the Bible and the Bible alone is the rule of faith and duty, he continued, does not shut out the gifts which God has set in the church. To reject them is shutting out that part of the Bible which presents them. We say, let us have a whole Bible, and let that alone be our rule of faith and action. Place the gifts where they belong, and all is harmony. Thus, according to James White, the Sabbatarians not only believed that the Bible was their rule of faith, but the acceptance of the prophetic gift confirmed that they accepted all of Scripture, including its teaching about the gifts. Of course, James White's underlying motive was to defend Ellen White's gift of prophecy. In a similar note, another Sabbath-keeping Adventist, G.W. Holt, wrote to the review that the Bible was his only rule of faith and duty. That did not mean, however, that he had to, and I quote, deny the gifts of the Holy Spirit, which were designed for the benefit of the church, he argued. And so similar arguments continue to appear in the review. The Sabbath-keeping believers therefore rejected the accusations of the messengers. The Bible and Ellen White's prophetic gift were not standing on equal grounds. The Bible was the only rule of faith, they argued, while the gifts had a supportive function to lead them to the Bible and his word. And by the way, Ellen White, if you read her views are very similar to that. She called herself the lesser light, leading people to the word of God. A second outcome from that controversy, and of course I'm summarizing them, was that the further development and clarifications of biblically grounded arguments defending the Sabbatarian belief in the gift of prophecy. So it helped them to kind of think more, from a biblical perspective, how we can defend our belief in Ellen White. One example was the connection of the gift of prophecy to the Sabbatarian understanding that they were living in the last days. The prophecy of Joel 2 was to be fulfilled in its entirety in the last days, the Sabbath keepers argued. Because of the Great Commission that Jesus gave to his followers, the gifts were not only available to the apostles, but they were to continue until the end of the world. That's a quote. David Arnold, for example, noted that the gift of prophecy was given throughout human history as circumstances demanded, end quote. God's plan of communication with the fallen humanity remained, and again, quote, unchanged from the days of Adam to the last days, he wrote, when his salvation work could be fully completed. Sabbath-keeping believers also connected the gift of prophecy to the concept of being the remnant people of God. So in a way, they're responding to the specific accusations. Based on Revelation 12:17, and they related it to Revelation 19:10, they claimed that God's remnant people would possess the gift of prophecy in their midst. And we use this argument even today. Furthermore, the Sabbatarians explained that the two main causes that the dragon or Satan, had this wrath against the remnant, according to Revelation 12:17, was the Sabbath and the spirit of prophecy. And I quote here what James White writes: the spirit of prophecy then will be with the Sabbath-keeping remnant and will be one thing to cause the dragon to make a war on them. James White even believed that perhaps there was nothing that would, and I quote here, excite the dragon's wrath more than the spirit of prophecy to be in the church. Thus, for the Sabbatarian Adventists, there was a clear connection between Ellen White's gift and the understanding of being the end-time remnant people of God. Another more practical concept that they developed was the Sabbatarian belief that Ellen White's prophetic gift brought unity among those who accepted it. As the gifts were necessary to guide and sustain the early church, the Adventists argued, they were also needed in their time to preserve the unity and purity of the church, of the remnant. In fact, the Sabbatarians noted that it was the messengers that began to cause divisions after they rejected Ellen White's prophetic claims. It is in this context that Sabbath-keeping believers began to discuss the necessity for formal organization. And I mean, I think it's because of the messengers they began to really talk about it, and you find a lot of discussions for the next several years until we officially organized in 1863. But I quote here, I will not read everything, but as early as 1853, Ellen White began to speak for the need of gospel order. I mean, you remember that quote, the Lord showed me that the gospel order has been too much feared and neglected and so forth. So even the discussion about formal organization were prompted by that crisis. So we organized in May of 1863, but I think that the messenger crisis had a lot to do with that, okay? The third outcome of the messenger's controversy was the Sabbatarian examination of the relationship between the gift of prophecy and the test of fellowship. That was a huge question, so they specifically tackled that issue. Should the prophetic gift of Ellen White be a test of fellowship? Even before their formal organization in 1863, the question demanded some discussions because of the messenger of truth challenges. The Sabbatarian view on the issue developed gradually in the 1850s and 1860s. Contrary to the claims of the messengers, the majority of Adventists, including Ellen White, believed that the acceptance of her prophetic gift was not a test of fellowship. The opposition on the issue, however, expressed initially by James White in the mid-1850s, seemed to be related to the Sabbatarian principle that the Bible was their only rule of faith of action. Because of the first issue that they discussed, they were very careful. They said, no, we have no other we have no other test but the Bible. And here I quote James White, there is a class of persons, he wrote, who are determined to have that the review, or the Sabbath believers, and its conductors make the view of Mrs. White a test of doctrine and Christian fellowship. It may be duty to notice these persons on account of the part they are acting, which is calculated to deceive some. Interestingly, the Sabbatarians also pointed that Case and Russell, the two ministers, the messenger leaders, were not disfellowship because they did not believe the visions of Ellen White, but because of their unchristian conduct towards others. Gradually, however, the Sabbath keepers started to give various nuances to the understanding of the test question. And I don't explain this in the paper, but that's because some people started writing to James White, well, I think you are putting down the gift of prophecy and so forth. So they began to work on this issue, what to do with that. One nuance was their view that Ellen White's gift was to be a test, but only for those who accepted her gift as having a divine origin. Then later on in 1861, 1861, Uriah Smith came up with a new explanation when he made the distinction between the doctrine of spiritual gifts and the gift of prophecy of Ellen White specifically. While he saw the belief in spiritual gifts to be a test of fellowship, he did not consider Ellen White's specific gift as such. So the argument was going back and forth. What is remarkable, however, for me, was to note that the Sabbath-keeping Adventists, including Ellen White, were willing to show a spirit of tolerance towards those who honestly were searching for answers concerning Ellen White's prophetic claims. Ellen White expressed this attitude well when she wrote, "No trial should exist or labor be taken up with those who have never seen the individual having visions and have no personal experience with the influence of the visions. Such should not be deprived of the benefit and privileges of church if their Christian conduct is otherwise correct and they have formed a good Christian character. Such must not be set aside, but long patience and brotherly love should be exercised towards them until they find their position and become established for or against the gifts." So that was the kind of the attitude that was at that time. A fourth outcome from the messenger controversy was the beginning of a much more intentional promotion and publication of the works related to or by Ellen White. The idea was to be proactive and introduce Ellen White to new Sabbatarian believers. A little bit of context will be helpful. By the early 1850s, the Sabbath-keeping leaders saw the widening prospect of evangelism to former Millerites and others. As early as 1851, James White noted that the door was now open almost everywhere to present the present truth, and many are prepared to read our publications who have formerly had no interest to investigate. So James White said, well, we have an opportunity, and using Review and Herald, using the Facebook, we can do a lot of evangelism to the former Millerites. In order to preserve the fundamental Sabbatarian belief that the Bible only was their rule of faith, and at the same time to escape any form of prejudices against the visions, James White and the Sabbatarians decided not to publish Ellen White in the main issue of the Review. As an alternative, Ellen White's revelations were to be published in what James White called Review and Herald, extra. In the first edition of the new publication, he wrote, and I will not read everything, but basically he said, Review and Herald will be for evangelism. We're not going to mention Ellen White, and Review and Herald extra will be for us. So we don't want anybody to have to accuse us that we are people of the visions, not the Bible. Interestingly, while the policy of not promoting the visions through the Review and Herald continue for the next several years, we do not find any other issue of the Review and Herald extra. The reasons for that seems to be an offer by certain Sabbath-keeping believers to pay for the publication of what became Ellen White's first book, Experiences and Views, a small book pamphlet containing the early experiences and visionary revelations of Ellen White. And then she wrote another booklet in 1854 called The Supplements to the Christian Experience and Views of Ellen White. And later on in 1855, a decision was made to publish Ellen White's messages in a single testimonies, single volumes. And I argue, I will skip that because of time, but I argue that that's why we don't have another Review and Herald extra, because all these publications kind of substituted that periodical and so forth. It's in the paper. In addition to Ellen White's own writings, the Sabbatarians also published a number of important works, and I mentioned some of them which became very apologetical. In 1858, Cottrell published a 16-page booklet entitled Spiritual Gifts. Then in 1862, you have Emin Cornell publish a book, Miraculous Powers, quite a large at that time, 143 pages, and it specifically tackled questions against the gift of prophecy, very comprehensive. So we began to publish apologetical books. The central theme of these apologetical attempts was to show the continuity of the gift of prophecy until the second coming of Jesus. Beyond that, the publication tackled questions raised by the messenger and the periodical. Although the arguments were mostly repetitive, the Sabbath-keeping Adventists extended kind of their thinking and tried to answer all of these issues. Okay, I will skip basically the few other, because we began for the first time to affirm Ellen White's prophetic gift of general conferences, and I mentioned few where we have her name mentioned for the first time and so forth. But let me go to the conclusion. The discovery of the messenger of truth, periodical, has given a new light in the Seventh-day Adventist understanding and acceptance of Ellen White's prophetic gift and its relationship to the denomination. Three general conclusions can be made as a result. First, the critical arguments published by the messengers forced the Sabbath-keeping believers to re-examine their view concerning the biblical validity of the gift of prophecy of Ellen White. Consequently, they developed a much more systematic responses to the raised objections, as this paper hopefully has demonstrated. One of the most valuable outcomes was the established relationship between the Bible and the prophetic gift. The Sabbath-keeping believers re-emphasized their belief in the sola scriptura principle. They never considered the gifts as being equal to the Bible. On the other hand, the Bible itself confirmed the existence of spiritual gifts, including the gift of prophecy, until the second coming of Jesus. After all gifts were promised in order to benefit God's people and their mission to proclaim the gospel until the end of time. Therefore, Ellen White's visions were not an exception to the rule, but rather a confirmation of the scriptures. Second conclusion, the Sabbatarian responses to the messenger's objections during the 1850s provided the Seventh-day Adventist denomination with essential theological arguments in defense of Ellen White's prophetic gift that became the basis for apologetical defense of her prophetic gift in later years. And I argue that everything, it's a repetition from that time. Notably, most of the arguments for or against Ellen White's prophetic gift today are mere repetition of those used by the messengers and the Sabbatarians during the debate in the 1850s. For instance, issues such as the role of Ellen White in relation to the Bible alone principle, the fulfillment of Joel 2 or Acts 2, the interpretation of the testimony of Jesus, Revelation 12:17, Ellen White and the test of fellowship question are still widely discussed within and outside of the Seventh-day Adventist community of believers. Those who question Ellen White's prophetic gift use most of the arguments found in the Messenger of Truth, while those who defend Ellen White repeat many of the early Sabbatarian arguments to prove that her gift was genuine and true. As the wise man Solomon writes, there is nothing new under the sun. The messenger's controversy, nevertheless, did help the Seventh-day Adventist denomination to develop further its biblical principles in defense of the gift of prophecy and its modern manifestation. Thus, Adventism solidified its stance on the acceptance of Ellen White's prophetic claims. Instead of destroying their confidence in the gift of prophecy, the messenger's objections helped the future Seventh-day Adventists to establish Ellen White's prophetic gift within their own theological system of belief. In other words, it helped us. It did not destroy our confidence in Ellen White. Third, and last thing, the messenger controversy emphasized the need to promote Ellen White's writing openly so that people could read her messages and make informed decisions for themselves to believe or disregard or disbelieve her prophetic claims. Ellen White, as this paper has shown, was in full accord with such an approach. After all, spiritual realities cannot be only intellectually defended, but must be personally experienced. For the Sabbath-keeping believers, Ellen White's gift had positive influences and brought unity among themselves. This was particularly important within the context of the messenger's controversy, and their critical objections published in the Messenger of Truth, which only divided believers. Therefore, having access to her writings and being introduced to her ministry was important and valuable, as it nullified many of the raised objections. Seventh-day Adventism today can learn from the messenger's crisis and the Sabbatarian approach to dealing with controversies over the gift of prophecy. Ellen White's prophetic gift is still discussed, reasoned within and without the Adventist circles today. At the same time, her writings have continued to be widely published and promoted as part of the denomination's mission. Beyond that, attempts have been made to put her out in the public square. Consequently, Ellen White has been recognized as having a remarkable role, not only in the development of the Seventh-day Adventism, but also within the development of the American Christianity in the United States. And here I quoted in spring of 2015 that Smithsonian Magazine listed Ellen White as among the 100 most significant Americans of all time. The Messenger controversy and the Messenger of Truth publication did not destroy the confidence of the Sabbath-keeping believers in Ellen White. On the contrary, it helped them to cement the acceptance and recognition of her gift. Learning from this episode, Seventh-day Adventism became more open to sharing their belief in the modern manifestation of the gift of prophecy and more confident in the acceptance of Ellen White's gift and her messages. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Levterov, for your presentation. Now it is time for Dr. Merlin-Burt to respond. Dr. Burt is a well-known researcher in Adventist Studies, and he's now the director of the Ellen G. White Estate. Dr. Merlin-Burt, you have until 12:10 to respond, around 13 minutes. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Levterov, for a very interesting presentation on these three issues of the Messenger of Truth and what we can learn from them. Being requested to respond to you led me back to your dissertation, and I carefully read again parts of your dissertation and observed that you summarized a little bit for this presentation. You actually had 6 points, and you really just shared about 4 from the Messenger of Truth, which is understandable in light of the time constraints. But I appreciate very much that you have carefully gone through the primary source and assessed carefully what they were saying, what they were doing. I think it would be useful at some point to actually, they are available, of course, at the Research Center and so forth, but it might be useful to do some sort of a publication of those 3 issues with some explanation of the history. You might give some thought to that. I don't know. We don't want to necessarily promote the Messenger of Truth, but it is an interesting story of the earliest, almost the earliest printed opposition to Ellen White. You have the Advent Harbinger and Sawyer, who are a little bit earlier, but it really is this paper that starts this work. I wish we could find some additional papers beyond these 3, and I just keep wondering if there are more. I kind of doubt, though, that there'll be much more that we'll learn by additional issues, but it does give us a sense of the color and the flavor of what they were doing. And thank you for your careful assessment of this and response to this. Just some suggestions and thoughts regarding this paper. I think the thing that stirred me up the most in thinking about this, when I've revisited this again in light of my giving this response, is what caused this all in the first place. You, in the first part of your paper, nicely lay out in a very summary form the 2 visions that Ellen White had that kind of step into this conflict as they come to Jackson, Michigan, where you have Abigail Palmer, who presumably, well, at least from looking at an unpublished source or two, which you might want to add to your paper, I'm thinking of Brian Strayer's anniversary presentation for Jackson, Michigan Church, and also some of the research of Gene Davis that's in a special collection at the Center for Adventist Research. You have this picture that tells us that behind theological arguments, which are you're addressing and dealing with, that somehow come from the messenger party, which they're misrepresenting really the Adventist position in a number of ways. I think you've shown that as well. But behind all of this is biography. The opposition to Ellen White through the years is often more biographical than theological, or at least the theological bounces off of the biographical or the story of what happens. And I'd like to research it more, but it seems like some of the issues that happened is the Palmers, and I have pictures of them. This is what I love too. This is really not for scholarship, but these are the Palmers. This is Dan and Abigail. She's the lady who's the controversial figure in this whole thing. And they live in this home. This is their home in Jackson, Michigan. It's gone now. The home isn't there anymore, but I guess their neighbors were against them. And from looking, I haven't verified it entirely, but from Brian Strayer's research, it seems that this neighbor was throwing dirty water out of the window and was trying to get it on the laundry that was drying from Mrs. Palmer. And this led her to rush out in anger and shout out, "You witch," or something like this, and a few more strong words, which were a problem. And the rest of the story that kind of develops here, which I know you're probably familiar with, is there at the house or nearby is Hiram Case's daughter, 17-year-old daughter. And she thought she heard a different word than witch. It was that word with a B, beginning with a B. I'm not going to say the word. And so she hurries home to her father and tells him what a terrible thing happened, and they begin to exhort and work on this terrible problem that the Palmers had produced. And so you have this biography that's behind it. And of course, the case is basically saying, "Are you calling my daughter a liar?" And then when Ellen White comes in with her first vision, essentially rebuking Abigail Palmer's loss of her Christian attitudes, but then being shown even in vision that she had not used the word that the daughter of Case had suggested, but rather the word witch. It was a bad word, but not a vile word. And they were all excited. But then the second testimony comes against them in their attitudes. So it becomes a conflict of experience as well as a conflict of story. And I could wish that there could be a little more unpacking of some of that part of the story in your paper, because I think it's connected. As I've looked through the messenger of truth, I think there's a lot of contriving of arguments that behind it has biographical conflict and opposition that's really the underlying issue. And I think of history, we need to keep that part in mind, and I know you have, but I think that would be helpful. With that, I would suggest that you probably add a little more of a review of sources. You did good primary work around the time, but there's some other secondary work on this. It might be good to look at whatever other secondary work has been done, just to kind of look at that, at least in a footnote that lists it. I like very well what you've done with connecting this to the later publications that happened just after this experience. Particularly your mentioning of Cottrell's Spiritual Gifts tract, the 16-page tract, and M.E. Cornell's Miraculous Powers. I realized that on the heels of the Messenger Party comes the Marian Party, you know, that leads then to the Church of God Seventh Day, and you have Schnook and Brinkerhoff, and you have the whole thing that happens there. But these are kind of a continuity of oppositions that do have theological arguments, and it leads also to this seminal publication by Uriah Smith in 1868, which really becomes the most complete early work, The Visions of Mrs. E.G. White, a Manifestation of Spiritual Gifts According to the Scriptures. I think it'd be worthwhile mentioning that and mentioning a little bit of the continuity that leads into this further movement, which doesn't die right away and has continued to this day. Messenger Party collapses. It's mainly a fight between people. But the the Schnook and Brinkerhoff movement, and then the Marian Party and the Church of God Seventh Day exists to this day, and they begin to publish a paper of opposition, The Hope of Israel. So you can't put too much of this in, but I think a little more connectedness would probably strengthen your paper just a little bit. I should mention, just maybe it's to pat you on the back a little bit. I appreciated that you have written not only your book and your dissertation and now this presentation, but you also have written the two important articles in the Ellen White Encyclopedia on both the Messenger Party and the Marian Party. And so I think those are well done and helpful contributions. So I would just like to end by again saying thank you for your good scholarship and your efforts to help people to understand better how the church related to these challenges, and to a degree how Ellen White related to them. Thank you for a good paper, and I look forward to reading it in its final form.
Dr. Levterov, you have 5 minutes to reply.
Well, since Dr. Burt is my boss, I mean, what can I say? No, I'm joking, but thank you, Dr. Burt. Very, very helpful suggestions, and I do realize, I mean, that is good, because most of the people who rejected Ellen White, it seems to me, and I agree with you, maybe I didn't show it well, had a personal issue with her that led to rejection and so forth of her goof, as you said, but biography issues. And it seems to me that it has continued, because with the Marian Party, it's the same. So I will try to do that. I think it's very helpful. I thought that I did it, but probably because of space, I tried to cut off some things. And the other suggestion, the continuity, I think it's very helpful. Maybe I can put a paragraph or something that will make it even clearer, the impact that controversy had for the future. So thank you so much for that.
Thank you, Dr. Levterov, and also Dr. Mellingbert for this wonderful discussion. What a pleasant morning we had together with these insightful 3 presentations. We have a lunch break now, and we should come back at 1:30 p.m. for continuing with the discussions and presentations for the afternoon. So have a good lunch break, and we see you back in 1:30 p.m.